Welcome to the Evansville Wartime Museum. The crowd's down a little bit today, but we still have a good turnout. Thanks for being here. So let's all who can rise, please rise. Let's pray together. Lord, our most merciful God, the creator of all of us, the creator of everything that exists, we give you great thanks for this day. We give you great thanks for the food that we're about to receive. We give great thanks for our volunteers, for this museum, for the Bronstein Foundation. There's so much to be thankful for. And today we pray for this nation, that this nation would endorse conversation among us and resist violence, that we are a nation of peace. We pray that our leaders would guide us along these ways so that all of our days may be filled with discussion and not violence. So we ask all of this in your name. Amen. Amen. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Larry Head will lead us in the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner.
Test. Please feel free to join. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Larry. There are a few things coming up in the near future at the museum I'd like to call your attention to. On the following weekend, September 27 and 28, there'll be a B-25 named Champagne Gal here at the museum. You can ride on that airplane, but you need to go to the website for the Champagne Gal rides and book your flight there. We do not book the rides here at the museum. There will be one flight on Saturday at 11:30 and a second flight on Sunday at 11 o'clock. The plane will be available for static tours. I think it arrives about 9 o'clock. We'll plan on the afternoon to fully be available for static tours. The next lunch and share speaker, taking this in order best I can, is going to be Donna Bone. She's going to be talking about the 1937 flood in Evansville. And for your grandkids, starting on the 16th of October, there's going to be a program called Boo at the Zoo. And there will be storytellers and other presentations That program lasts until the 31st of Halloween. So the museum will be decorated in Halloween theme, and on the weekends for sure we're going to have activities. So bring your grandkids. There. Larry's my helper today. He's editing me. It's called We Can Boo It. Remember that, We Can Boo It. And then a really good speaker is coming here to the Evansville Museum on Saturday, the 25th of October. His name is Alex Kaur. Alex is the son of Eva Kaur, which you may know of, a Holocaust survivor, and also his dad, Mickey. They both survived the Holocaust. And Alex is here to celebrate his dad's 100th birthday. His dad has passed on, but he wanted to come to Evansville and celebrate with us. Alex was a podiatrist here in Evansville for a number of years. He knows a lot of people here. People from Terre Haute at the Candles Museum will be coming down here.
Last two rows?
It's a big thing. Program starts at 10:30 on Saturday morning. So today there's a program. Oh, one other thing.
Okay.
When you make an email reservation for the lunch and shares, please use the lunch learn at Evansville wartimemuseum.org. There are other emails that have been used, but they don't necessarily get trapped as far as making a reservation. So always remember, it's lunchlearn at evansvillewartimemuseum.org. Today we had a program change, a last-minute change, because Stephanie Pitchers, who was set to speak, became ill. And on the spur of the moment, to help us out, Kathy Decker is going to present an update on the Education Committee. Great program. They will have over 1,000 kids that they address every year. I don't know that I want to tell you more than that because Kathy's going to tell you about that. And then Mike Lynn is going to follow, and he's going to talk about the Modification Center here in Evansville. So Kathy, come on up.
Thank you, Johnny. I'm the last minute opening act here today. And as you know, when we pass that hat around, a lot of times those funds go toward our education committee. So I just wanted to take an opportunity to give you guys an update on what we're doing, how we're reaching out, how we're doing our best to teach kids about what we did here in Evansville during the war. And we have several members of our committee around here, so this is definitely a joint effort, and I am speaking for them. So we recently did, I guess last Monday, we did a really nice presentation for the EVSC, what they call their big table, because we're really trying to get more field trips here, and we were lucky enough to have them invite us. So I'm just going to go through the same presentation that I did for them, if that's okay. And then we'll have some question and answer afterwards. So we like to start out with our mission statement for the Education Committee: to educate all ages regarding how industry, home front workers, and military veterans supported our nation in times of conflict through programming and interpretation of historic narratives and artifacts. And then among the topics that we're going to be covering with the kids: World War II, home front, transportation, honor gallery, Red Cross, Rose of the Riveter. We try to get it all in the short amount of time we have these kids. We like to talk to them about the definition of freedom, how all these men went to war to save our lives and give us freedom. And specifically, we like to talk about Alan Sanderson, which I know you've all heard about. He was a very successful P-47 pilot, flew 118 missions, and was married to our wonderful Nancy Sanderson, who is the Education Committee chairperson. Back there in the back. Wave, Nancy. Thanks. We also like to talk to them about patriotism. And we like to have them close their eyes, think for a minute what comes to mind whenever we talk about patriotism. Maybe they think about the Statue of Liberty. Maybe they think about our flag. Maybe they think about our country or a picture of Uncle Sam. So we like to have them, kind of visualize what we're talking about. And then we jump into manufacturing in Evansville, which we all know that's what we're here for the most part. So we talk about the LSTs, made 167, more than any other shipyard in the country. We talk about the P-47s, made 6,242 of those. And of course, the kids that come in here love the P-47. That's a big attraction for them. So to give them a visualization, we show them that the size of a P-47 and an LST together are about the size of a football field. Just to give them some idea, because most kids know, how big a football field is. We also talk to them about all the bullets that we made here, over 3.2 billion bullets. Kids have a hard time comprehending that number, so we tell them that it's enough bullets to go around the world 3 times. And they're pretty impressed with that. Come on. We love to talk to them about our Sherman tank because that is such a special piece of equipment here. So here we have Tom David taking a group of probably 8 or 9-year-olds around, showing them Rosie. Picture Rosie at probably the 4-H fairgrounds. We talk about how we refurbished over 600 or 1,600 of them because we didn't make them here. Love talking about Carl K. Connect because we can connect that to our zoo, and most kids have been to the zoo, but they don't know the story of Carl, so we tell them that, he was a journalist here from 1906 to 1960. During the war, he did a lot of cartoons depicting the war, and we like to tell them that most of Carl's drawings, right here in the lower right-hand corner where his signature line is, he drew an elephant because he loved elephants, and of course, the very first elephant at the zoo was named Kay. We also support STEM, and we really like to drive that home to the administrators because we talk about milkweed pods, which is science. We talk about, they go to the simulator, which is engineering. Then we talk about rationing and ration cards so that they understand the mathematical issues that we were going through during the war. We talk about minority contributions. This is very important for kids to learn and to understand. So we talk about the 761st, which is one of 3 black tank regiments. We talk about the 6888, Charity Adams and her group that sorted through all the mail. We talk about nurses of color that were primarily designated to work at POW camps or minority military bases. We talk about women. Let them know what Rosie did. It wasn't just a riveter or a welder. Rosie's did just about everything during the war. Wax, 150,000 of them, 160 lost their lives. Wasps, 38 lost their lives. And waves, 69. So it's important to make them understand that women weren't just in the war to fill in space. They put their lives in danger every day. We also take them through the Holocaust if it's age appropriate. Typically, we do not introduce them to the Holocaust until maybe grade 5 through 12, because it's a little bit heavy and dark for ages underneath that. And we really drive home what kids did in school, because it's important to let them know that kids weren't just, playing in the streets. They were actually contributing. They were collecting milkweed pods. They were collecting scrap. They were selling war bonds. So now we're going to get into the numbers of what we're doing, because we do a survey with the administrators before they leave and also with the kids. So between January and June, we had a total of 680 kids here through all these schools. We put together a survey so that the administrators can rank us on, what we can do better. So we asked them, rate your satisfaction with the home front gallery or the Holocaust exhibit or your overall experience today. And then we chart those on a scale of 1 to 5. They can answer, best score being a 40. And we routinely get 40, high 30s, as you can see there on our efforts with the administrators. The only thing that really knocks us down sometimes is they say that they would have had it like to have more time, but we're going off of what they tell us they can do, so that our hands are kind of tied there. But the teachers' comments, the students enjoyed all the areas, they enjoyed the simulator, visit was well organized, found it interesting to learn how impactful Evansville was during the war, on and on and on. This is just 3 of, 40 or 50 comments. We also have a survey for the kids because we want to understand, are you learning something? We need to be able to gauge what they're learning so that we know what else to teach them. So we ask them these questions. How important was manufacturing in Evansville to winning the war? What do you think was Evansville's most important contribution? Children's activities were important to help win the war, true or false? What new information did you learn about the war during your tour or presentation? So we put those together in some charts. And the first question, how important was manufacturing in Evansville? Obviously, 97% said very. 5% or 3% said somewhat. So you can gauge by the way they answer these questions. Are they learning something? Are they picking something up and taking it back home with them? Next question, what do you think was Evansville's most important contribution to winning the war? Was it bullets, the LST, the P-47, the canteen, or all of the above? 79% chose all of the above. So when we're teaching the kids about all of these different areas, they are definitely paying attention, and that's what we're striving to get is, their level of understanding. 3, children's activities were very important to help with World War II, true or false? 86% said true, 14% said false. So I don't know where they were during that tour, but we do talk about it. What new information did you learn about the war during your tour? 558 responses. This is all over the board. 45% said all of the above. 25% said the industrial production they learned about. 3% said the Holocaust, and 17% said women, because a lot of times in school they're not teaching what women did during the war, I don't think, so we let them know that that was important. And then 5, after your tour of the Evansville Wartime Museum, do you have a better understanding of Evansville's contribution to the war? And that was an easy one. 2% said no, 98% said yes. So this is what we're doing to try and understand what we're teaching the kids. Are they learning? Because we think it's very important that our kids know what Evansville did. So here's some comments from the kids. They loved the stories from the volunteers. They enjoyed the items, the uniforms, the planes. Kirk's explanation of the Holocaust was very informative. Enjoyed Ken talking about his experiences. Ken is our resident artist, Ken Epler. Would like more information about women's involvement. Love the huge amount of items to look at. So we constantly get really, really good feedback from the kids, so we know we're reaching them. We know they enjoy coming here, and we want to continue. And with your support and your contributions, we also have an alliance grant from Vanderbilt County that allows us to provide busing for some of the schools that can't afford buses. We also have a wonderful endowment from Mr. Huddleston, who was a P-47 fighter pilot, and he's in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he's very, very supportive of our educational efforts. So that is all of my presentation. I just want to give you a little bit of, knowledge of what we're doing and how we're reaching out. Any questions?
Why do we collect milkweed?
So back during the war, the kids would go out in the fields and collect bags of milkweed pods. And the inside of the pods were kind of a flaxy material, and they used that flaxy material to stuff life vests. So we try to drive home to the kids that, these kids knew they were saving sailors' lives when they were collecting the milkweed pods, and they always find that very interesting. The other one they find interesting is the kids that collect cooking fat and take it to school, because they don't realize that cooking fat was used to make explosives, and they find that very interesting. So we love telling the kids all this little trivia stuff that they're not going to learn in a book anywhere, and we hope it resonates with them. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Mike Lynn.
Thank you, Kathy. Mike Lynn is in exhibits and collections. Mike has a huge knowledge of history of Evansville. So his talk is about the Modification Center right here on the Evansville property. It's no longer here. Mike's a longtime Evansville resident, went to University of Evansville, and without any other announcements, I'll give it to Mike.
Do that. There we go. Move the switch so it turns green. There you go. Okay. I'm going to talk about the Modification Center. And I've been working on putting together an exhibit on the Modification Center. So this sort of, I was getting to the tail end of getting all my material together, so it sort of worked out that I can put this together and talk about it. So hopefully in a few weeks, there'll be some of the same material in an exhibit here at the museum. But I know there's not a lot of material out there on our particular Modification Center. And one of my primary sources of information was the Ken Wilson aviation archives that we have here in the museum that we're in the process of digitizing to get it out on the web. So he had done for many years collecting information, talking to people that worked there, conducting interviews. So my presentation here, I'm going to take a lot of information from two people that he interviewed starting in 1986 and again in 93 and 1997. And these two gentlemen, one by the name of Gil Urban, and he was actually the general manager of the Mod Center, okay? So a lot of good information there. And then a person by the name of Bill Engel. He was the manager of training, but he also did a lot of procurement and a lot of different odd jobs there at the Mod Center. So, the reason it's called number 6 is because in the sequence of numbering them, there was actually 24, and we'll go over that, across the United States. So the planning to put a modification center here at Evansville happened reasonably early. So that's why it's Modification Center number 6. Okay, why do we have a modification center? It wasn't just for adding things for if a P-47 was going to be flown in Africa, you added different things to it. The biggest thing is that the idea was developed in the Army Air Corps headquarters at Wright Field. Now remember, in World War II, you didn't have the Pentagon. So all the planning, organization, ideas, the Air Corps was centered out of Wright Field in terms of all their planning and everything, okay? There was a person there, based on my research, Colonel Boatner, that came up with the ideas based on when we started ramping up our military aircraft production in 40 and 41 with all the appropriations, the Lend-Lease, France and Britain making orders. They quickly learned that ramping things up, they would get a lot of reduced production by constantly introducing design changes into the assembly line. If anyone's been in manufacturing, you got everybody trained, you got everything tooled, and if you keep adding little tweaks to it, it's going to slow everything down. So they came up with the idea of all aircraft, whether it's bombers, P-47s, P-51s, whatever, they were going to use the design block methodology, okay? So what that means is that this design block in terms of making changes to the line, there may be 150 planes that would get manufactured, come off the line, and they wouldn't have the latest and greatest required
changes to them to make them better in combat, make them better for the theater. And then Wright Field would say, hey, we've got this design block coming off here. We're going to ship those planes, either send them all to one or divide them up, and they were going to go to these modification centers, and we know exactly what to do to modify them because all the engineers had figured out most of the time how to modify them, and then they would, for example, B-17s, whenever they made a change of going to a later model where they had a whole redesign back end where it was more spacious for the tail gunner, those B-17s would be made with the original configuration. They would be sent to a modification center and they would rework that entire tail before they would be sent off to the theater that they were going to be used over to Europe. Another wing is theater specifics. Obviously, if the planes were being sent P-47s to the Pacific, good example there is they had extra wing tanks that wouldn't necessarily be coming out of the factory. If they were up in the cold weather, they would have specific equipment to maybe thin the oil down a little bit for starting in cold weather, different systems like that. And then special functions. Our mod center did things like convert planes to be able to carry towing targets for stuff like that. They converted planes, I'll get into that, where they installed specific equipment so that they could do geographic mapping, different stuff like that for the Air Force. Modification centers were built at aircraft factories, just like here when Republic built this plant, they automatically added a modification center to it, and existing commercial airline maintenance hubs. So everything was geared toward the military, but they had these facilities already set up for doing the same kind of work. And so those were built there. Okay, there were 24 modification centers set up all across the US, so it wasn't just Evansville. And our modification center cost a little over $1 million to build it. And that's equivalent to about $20 million in today's dollars. And I'll go over this, but expanded facilities, the Evansville Center and also the Republic factory, they were built under the oversight of the Army Corps of Engineers. So just a little tidbit there is that, the Republic plant wasn't built by Republic, okay, and neither was the Modification Center. The Modification Center was associated under the management of Republic, but the way things worked in that big expansion in late 41 into 42 is that the government had the money, but then they had to work with industry to get these big facilities built. So, like the Republic factory, that was all paid for in the big contract for producing P-47s. So Republic did not have to front necessarily the money. That was all built into the cost of the planes they were going to do. And then they were able to, as part of the legislation through Congress, they were able to get the depreciation down. I know it's a little counting there, but instead of depreciating over 20 years, I think they depreciated most of these big facilities in 5 years. So it made it more conducive to these private industries to join in the war effort, okay? And then, because when they were gearing up for all this, there was a lot of companies that were saying, well, if we build these big plants, they're going to be customized to build munitions, to build war material, and we're not going to be able to use them for civilian afterwards. So those were some of the reasons that this was all done through the Army Corps of Engineers. Okay, where was the Modification Center? So I took a Google map of last year's aerial photography. This is the existing airport right here. Here is us where we're sitting here. There's your Dairy Queen. Up here, here's the airport, parking lot, the new road they made. The modification of the rail line goes up there, and then this is taken from a drawing from 1942 where they were laying out the new facilities. So there's the Modification Center. There's Republic, obviously, right there. You didn't have St. George Road going all the way through. But if you would look over across the field right now, it's basically about where the safety building is and not too far from where that big training facility, which is the fuselage of the C-130. That's where the modification center was. Okay, here's an aerial photograph of the plants being built back in 1942. Here's actually the Republic plant. First thing they built was this hangar right here, so they could start bringing in pieces and parts and start assembling some aircraft. Hoosier Spirit 1, that was put together before the rest of this was built. And they got a lot of the parts from Farmingdale, and they used that as the way to figure out how to make airplanes and plan for it. You see the airport here. Here's where they laid out the foundations and everything for the Mod Center. And like right over in here is where we would be. I did a little zooming here. So here, just for info, here's the Republic plant. You can see where they started to work on these 4 long big buildings here where they would do the assembly lines. You can see all the people parked there. There's that. And then here's where they were building the office buildings. Okay, so that was all going on. Estimate this to be probably late spring or early summer was this picture right here. And then over here you can see a little close-up of Modification Center. Back then, I mean, a lot of, especially younger people, have no idea what everything looked like back then, but this road went all the way over here, curved around, and the railroad track that was over here, it met up in this area. So everything's been totally reconfigured nowadays. So it's hard to imagine where that was at. And just for fun, I zoomed in on the windmill over here. So where Dairy Queen and the gas station is, that used to be a little motel by the side of 41. So if you were going from traveling along 41 going north, you could stop in here and they had little cottages there and you could stay overnight and then go on your way. So that's why it was called the windmill, okay? And you can see where 41 was 2 lanes through here, and it was 1 lane going north here, and then this is your railroad tracks. That's what it looked like back then. Okay, so the Mod Center was built in 42. It was completed in the fall. That's what it looked like. You had a huge hangar area there. This was a picture probably in 44. But you can see, this is north. You can see where that's laid out. You had buildings here, warehouse buildings, workshops, design areas, another building here, and then on each side of the building you had offices and workspaces so that they could work both. Most of the plane work was done inside the hangar. The modification center at its peak employed close to 600 employees. Okay. So one thing to talk about, as this was being completed, the personnel that came into both the Republic plant and the modification center, Republic basically cherry-picked a lot of people out of their Farmingdale works, okay, to lead. The actual manager, Gil Irvin, for the modification center, he was the material manager up at Farmingdale, which means he was over procurement, different things like that. He came down in very spring of 42, and he was designated to work at the Mod Center. And so at that point, he had a very small team, and they started recruiting. You had to do all the hiring and get all that stuff going while the plant was being built. And then the plant wasn't finished until close to probably September, October of 42. So he had some interesting things in these transcripts. And during the presentation here, I may read from some of the transcripts because some very interesting stories, instead of me just paraphrasing them. But one of the things with Gil Irvin in that period of time when they were building everything, one of the things you got to remember is Army procurement was very much involved in every aspect of both the Republic plant and the Mod Center. So all procurement, purchase orders and everything would have to go through a hierarchy, and the Air Force was involved in approving all that, okay? And they kept a sharp eye out on what was going on. And one of the interesting things he said is that when they were building all this, somebody attempted to bribe him It was a contractor wanting to put in wanting to bid for the fluorescent lights, and he said offered him $10,000 if he would give the contract to him. And he said obviously he didn't. Needless to say, I didn't bite on that. He said somebody later did and got sent to jail for it. So that stuff was going on at that time, and you had a lot of oversight. So $10,000 back then, that was $200,000 in today's dollars. So it was a fairly big bribe. Gil Irvin, the manager, he worked for Mundy Peel. Mundy Peel was the general manager of the Republic plant. Okay, and he later on became I don't know if he became the CEO, but was very high executive vice president in Republic in later years. So he had a very long-standing career, the person that ran the Republic plant. And then they pulled in people from Farmingdale, and then also they pulled a lot of local people. And Bill Engel made the comment a lot of times they didn't know what they were doing, because being experts in aviation, that wasn't just common. People knew how to work on cars, they knew how to work on trucks, different things like that. But aviation was a whole different ball of wax, okay? So they had to do a lot of training and everything. And so part of what they would do with existing people, they had to work with the main plant, but a lot of times at the beginning, it was a problem working with the main plant because they wanted to be in control of everything, and they eventually got more separation from the main plant, so they wouldn't have to have all their POs, purchase orders, go through the main plant, and it was just slowing things down. Now, they did have some relationships with the main plant. One of the stories they talked about was a guy by the name of Tully Filardo was his name, and he was a scrounger. So whenever they would get a contract in and they need some specialty parts, or they ran out of parts, he would just said, the only thing we did like about them, this is Gil Irvin, is we could go over there and scrounge all the parts we needed. We had a guy who was something else. His name was Tully Filardo. He could steal anybody blind. He would pinch things. He would run short of something and he would say, wait a minute. Half an hour later, he would come back with pockets full of it from over there. He would always wear a big coat, and he said he must have had a dozen pockets in that thing like Groucho Marx. So, and I think he had started working over at the Republic plant, so he knew some people over there. So I'm sure him going over and doing things messed up their inventory system, because he would take things from the bin and they wouldn't know what they had. So some interesting things. So this picture right here, all right, you can see a couple of the Air Force people that were overseeing things. And one thing about the modification center is all the orders would come out of Wright Field. So they sort of had central control about what planes would come into the different modification centers, and they would put out an order ahead of time because they knew they would have, let's say, 50 planes from here that we needed to do something with. And then they would come and get that to the modification center, and then they would have to figure out, okay, we've got this coming, we think they're going to be coming in 4 to 5 weeks, let's get ready for it. And they would order material, they would figure out what the modifications were, they would do training if they'd have to do that. But sometimes, I'll go over with the B-25, sometimes they really didn't know, and they had to either improvise or make a lot of effort to get experts in, so they would tell them how to make these modifications. So right here, along here, you see R.G. Irvin. That's him right there, fairly young guy, probably in his mid-30s. And then you had the two Air Force people right there. Now these Air Force guys, I think one of them both of them were pilots, but one was a certified Army pilot, and the other one was more of a civilian pilot. So there's, probably won't go into it, but there's a couple stories they had about these guys always had to take the planes up, either fly down to Breckenridge, fly over to Wright Field, but they had to fly every plane that came there because, of their position. And they said this one story where I think it was this guy, he was in such a big rush, the first time they got a P-51 in, it's like, okay, I'm going to take that over there. I'm not just going to ride on a transport plane. I'm going to take that over there and I'm going to beat him there. Okay, so we got into the plane, and I don't know if he knew about all the intricacies of the P-51, but he started priming that thing, and they kept yelling at him, close your canopy, and he wouldn't listen to him because he knew what he was needing to do. So then once that thing finally caught, you had flames going everywhere because that's just the way that plane did. And you normally close your canopy so that all wouldn't get into the canopy. So we finally started up, and I think he singed all his eyebrows and everything off. So they had a good laugh at that. And then he didn't realize they had chocks on the wheels. So he almost stood the tail up on his end because he was trying to get going. So they finally said, hey, slow it down. So they finally let him go, and off he went to the Wild Blue Yonder. So that was one of the stories they had. Okay, P-47s. Okay. Some of the first modifications they did on P-47s was that they had to do they had a tail issue where the tail would flutter at certain performance, characteristics, either speed, diving, wherever they were at. So that was some of the first things they did where they would be coming in, and this was so early on P-47s that the actual control surfaces on the tail were actually fabric. Some of the first ones coming off, they were fabric sections. So they brought those to the modification centers, and they would get back into the plane, and they would make those required strengthening of the struts and different things like that. Another early modification was to put an oil dilution system in there so that certain times of the year that they could make the planes easier to start. So different things like that. This picture shows a P-47 that's got drop tanks on it. That was a lot of modifications they did with those. One interesting story Bill Engel talks about was that when they first started, they would pack that hangar full of planes, and they would make a point of filling up every one of those planes with gas all the way to the top, because it was extremely important to not have empty space in any of the tanks. Especially, they had issues with these, if they had any with wing tanks coming in there, they would make sure if they were doing work on them to fill them up with the liquid so you wouldn't have those fumes. He said they had one instance where a guy was welding on one of these, and they think they had paint fumes in it. And the guy did survive, but it basically blew him up into the lights of the ceiling because it exploded, so he was very lucky. So a lot of people are saying, hey, more gas in the planes in the hangar is a bad thing. And they're saying, no, that's the proper procedure. The other thing, obviously you've seen pictures in here is adding the rocket pads. And then they would also add, depending on where they were going and what the squadron mission would be, they would add the different bomb racks and attachment points and stuff. Those are some of the things that they would do for the P-47 in addition to making minor changes from these design blocks. Okay, Republic Aviation News, they had portions dealing with the Mod Center, and you've heard of Dilbert, but not Dilbert the office guy. Dilbert the Duck made it to the Aviation News plenty of times, and the motto of the Mod Center also was quick and dirty. Is get these planes out, do what you need to do, not wait for maybe pretty drawings or figure it out, get it done, and get them out to the front. So this is sort of a humorous thing where it says, remember I warned you about stopping at the Mod Center. So Dilbert the Duck's got better radio equipment, an extra turret in his tail, machine guns, and drop tanks. So that was a cartoon that came out. Okay, some of the different planes that came in. You can see, this is taken from the inside of the cockpit of a P-47, but you can see a B-29 here. A lot of P-47s lined up here, ready for modifications, and here's a B-17. I dare say some of these are probably some slight modifications, I'm just guessing, but they could be photographic reconnaissance type things or other things put on there. A lot of times the bigger bombers, they would probably fly those probably closer to their manufacturing areas. And just going back, notice obviously the Mod Center had wire and guard shacks around there too during war. These are also another planes. You can't see this, but this was a C-78 that they had in there. You got a UC-45B, an A-35A, that's a Vultee, and they got a lot of Vultees. I got a little story about that later on. And then this was P-38J. P-38s and P-51s we'll talk about. They were mainly modifying them for photographic reconnaissance. So P-38, they would replace most of the ordnance and machine guns in the nose and put a camera in the nose of the P-38. Okay, talking about the B-25. So B-25s were modified from, most of them from the C versions to the G and the H versions. I don't have I haven't got my research done trying to get a total count. I know at least more than 25 to 30 and maybe less than 70 were converted here at the modification center. Only what we did here was adding the 75 millimeter gun. I believe either at other modification centers or at the manufacturing facility. Most of them came out of Kansas City. They'd already have the machine guns. They would have the solid nose that would hinge up. This is a picture of B-25 GRH in the theater. Looks like in the Pacific, and that's what that would look like. Now, one of the things that whenever they got the order that they were going to convert these B-25s and put the 75 millimeter gun, the very first of them, it was basically an infantry gun. Okay, it wasn't the aircraft model that was specifically designed to put on aircraft. So the first ones they put in was an infantry 75 millimeter gun, and that's the size of the shell right there. And this actually was probably one of the first ones they converted. And I think if you, I can't zoom it in, but if you could look at this guy who's in the cockpit, that's a guy by the name of Oscar Haas, who was the head test pilot at the modification center. The Republic plant had their own test pilots, and then the modification center had another set of test pilots so they would do their flying. But I'll read you some of this narration here. And so it's like, tell me about the first G models you did. And Irwin was saying, we literally had no drawings on it when they first came in. And these were, the person who converted these in the 7th, 5th, and later 7th Air Force was Pappy Gunn, if you've heard of him. And so if you've heard of the term Kenny's Kids, down in New Guinea, they did all kinds of on-the-fly modifications to B-25s and 6s and A-20s, adding more firepower for strafing, because that was more effective than just bombing the Japanese airfields. So they had some sketches. They were good sketches. That's all we got when the first airplanes arrived. He can remember his engineer, Woody Ringroth. He was chief engineer at the time. He said, how in the heck are we expected to do this kind of job when we know nothing about the airplane and don't have any drawings? I don't want to stick my neck out and cut here when I didn't know what it was stressed for. So they called Wright Field, and they said, yeah, we've got some people that can help, but they're all tied up. So then what they ended up doing is they called Wright Field and say, look, if you want us to do this, you got to get us some experts out of Kansas City. So the Army Air Force from there called Kansas City, and boom, they got somebody out. So they were able to come in with the guy who came in, he actually had copies of the hand sketches from Pappy Gunn, and they brought him in there, and he spent a few days with their chief engineer telling him exactly, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do. Because one thing I realized when they make this conversion on there, adding all that weight in the front changes the centers of gravity of the plane. Also, the recoil of that gun, you got to make sure every time you do a recoil, you're not constantly bending something and would mess up the integrity of the aircraft. So, bear with me here. So Irvin's saying, yeah, the first installation, Oscar Haas, Jimmy Gusti, and he's forgotten who the third one was in the air game. We called over to Breckenridge and said, can we use your firing range? They said, yeah, we can clear it out for you if you give us 2 days notice. We'll give you a specific time and you'll have 1 hour. That's all we can give you. Now, another time they went out there, and I guess the wires got crossed, so they went out there to do some strafing runs, and I think the guys at Breckenridge shot back at them because they weren't cleared out yet. You had infantry training there, so it was important to coordinate that. And in the future, since they got all these planes in, they said, okay, we're not going to try to coordinate that with Breckenridge. They actually would take the planes when they're ready to test fire everything, they would fly them up to Lake Michigan and make a day trip about it, and then they would fire the gun over Lake Michigan is how they would test it. But anyway, the first time they fired the gun. So I can remember discussing with Oscar before we went in, at what altitude should we fire this first one at. He decided it was going to be 1,000 feet. We didn't want to go down any lower at that point because we didn't know enough about everything. I can't remember which one of the other pilots was a co-pilot. Oscar was flying it at the time. We got out over the firing range at Breckenridge, and Oscar hollered back to Jimmy Gustini, "Pull the lanyard, Jimmy, pull the lanyard." Okay. So they fired it, and just like the field gun, you yanked on the lanyard. Oscar said all of a sudden the whole nose of the airplane was engulfed in flame. He said it was more smoke than flame, though. His vision was definitely obscured. Let's put it that way. And then the tape, I think, had some laughter on it. He couldn't imagine what had happened, so they had to on all the future ones, they had to engineer and put a shroud to dampen the muzzle blast so that you wouldn't get all that smoke in the muzzle blast whenever you would fire that. So that was some of the insights when they went out and test fired. Now, when they switched to with the aircraft version, since it had a shorter recoil on it, distance, it really shook the airplane a lot more, but it was a faster firing. You didn't have a manual reload, and you actually had clips, I believe, of 4 75mm rounds they would put in that gun, and it would fire about every, I think the action was probably 3 to 5 seconds on each one, so you could go boom, boom, and then they could get a lot more in there, but it did make a big difference in terms of how the airplane felt when you fired it between the two guns. Okay, test pilots at the Mod Center. Okay, this was your typical test pilot, Jim Hawkins. This is a picture he had taken, and you can see here, wishing the best of luck, very good friends, John and Margaret. Not sure who those are, but this was what pilots look like. Now, we see the test pilots on Republic photos, they're all in their flight suits and everything. These guys are basically stepped out of the office in their office clothes, put on a parachute and a radio, and they would go up and do their test flying. And this is Oscar Haas right there. I think he's on the wing, possibly of a P-47. Not quite sure. But Bill Engel, talk about test pilots. They got some P-47s in that they modified for being trainers, which means they would take out in the space behind the pilot, they would put a jump seat back there. And I'm not sure, I need to do some research on whether there was actually a dual set of controls, I'm not sure, but those were trainers, where you could take 2 people up in the P-47. So part of the interviews that Wilson said, can you tell me any flights that Oscar Haas had where he had any problems with, okay, or close calls? And he said, yes, I can tell you one because I happen to be in it. This was in a Curtiss-built piggyback job. So Curtiss, if you look on our chart in the back, Curtiss did build some P-47s, not very many of them, but they had gotten these Curtiss-built ones in because they had to finish them up and fix them because they said the aluminum work on those planes were horrible. Bill Engel said it was sort of like a laughing stock in terms of they didn't know what they were doing, but they fixed them. And then I guess once they had those going, then they gave some people some rides on them. And this is another Dilbert cartoon. Basically says, here comes Dilbert. I promised him a ride in the Link trainer. Okay, and you can tell by the picture there, yeah, that's Oscar Haas. So Engel said, yeah, that's right. It's the only flight I ever had on a P-47. Oscar took me up probably 3,000 feet or something of that sort. He stood that thing right on its nose. I never saw a postage stamp bloom so quickly in all my life into the airport as that thing did. He was buzzing the Mod Center. When he pulled out, I blanked out. It wouldn't have made any difference to me, but he cleared that hangar there by just a matter of feet. There was quite a little hell raised about that. I asked Oscar later, how close did we come to that thing? Of course, I was out, and as I said, he said, a lot closer than I had intended. And there was a little laughter on the table. And he says, I was pulling out of this thing, and it was mushing on me. There wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. It was just mushing. I don't know. I thought we were goners, really. So he said, I can't remember any other problems Oscar had, but he said, that would have been one big problem for a lot of people if he didn't pull out of that. Because if he was buzzing the mod center, imagine all the planes in there and everything else. So that was an interesting story. Okay, P-51s. They did get quite a few P-51s in, and they modified them for photo reconnaissance. So you would have, we actually have up in the archives I saw where they actually got the book that they got that said, here's what you do to convert it to a photo reconnaissance. So they would have the camera in here, lenses be down there, and all the equipment would be there, and they had to redo some things in here, re-strengthen this to hold that camera back there. And what they would do is this would be for shooting what you would call oblique pictures, okay? And this camera had I think it was a motor-controlled shutter and motor control where the film would go through. And what they would do is on these type, the pilot would know about what speed that the camera is synchronized to. So if it was synchronized to this plane going at, let's say, 330 mile an hour, then that's what he would need to get through before he hit the button for the camera. And how they would test these is that they would send somebody out, whether it was somebody from the office, secretary, and they would put them out on the close to the runway with sitting in a chair reading a newspaper. And then they would run these planes by there, and then when they would develop the film, they would say these cameras are so good that you would read clearly the headlines. You couldn't read obviously the type, but you could read the headlines on a newspaper of somebody on the ground buzzing by them at 330 mile an hour. So it was pretty impressive. Another thing about remember you still had Army procurement overseeing everything. So this story here is talking about P-51 antifreeze. When they first got their P-51s in, we had some engine work to be done on them. This is Engel talking. It was mandatory that we had to drain the coolant out of them. And they were just draining it in the little ditch outside the east of the mod center. No EPA rules, obviously, back then. Okay, here it was in the dead of winter, and our own people's cars were freezing up because they couldn't get any kind of glycol because of rationing, or even alcohol. We were having some absenteeism. So he went to Bailey Wright, that commander, our Army Air Force representatives, and said, how about let's save some of this and give it to our workers here? And he said, hell no, that's government equipment. You can't do a thing with it. You can't buy it, you can't sell it, and you can't steal it. You just drain it on the ground. And I said, well, Bailey, that's a hell of a way to help the war effort. People aren't coming to work because they don't have it here, and we're draining it on the ground. If we had a carboy or two out here in a big container and we drained it into that, you wouldn't know anything about it. He said, well, if I didn't see it, I wouldn't know about it. And I said, well, if somebody came to you and told you about it, he said, well, I'll think something up. So we went down to Charles Light Company and got a bunch of big old glass carboys. I think they probably held 10 gallons apiece or something like that. We would drain it into those, and then we would parcel out to employees at no charge. We weren't selling it or anything. And then the interviewer said, at the mod center only, and he said, yes, at the modification center, the Indiana division didn't get any of those goodies. So that was something they did. Okay, there's a whole story about the A-35 or A-31, A-35 Vultee Vengeance. These were planes that originally were designed, and I think I'm right in this, they were ordered, I think, originally by France or Great Britain as Lend-Lease. They were a dive bomber. So from the Army Air Force, we really didn't need a dive bomber because we had P-47s, okay? England didn't necessarily need a dive bomber because they had mosquitoes and they had Hawk Typhoons. So these were, once they were built, I think they sat over on an airfield over in New Jersey for almost a year because no one knew what to do with them. And then they decided, okay, Britain will still take them now, but they're going to be used to tow targets for training. So then people learning to do some form of gunnery combat can practice with these. So they flew them out from New Jersey, had them parked here, and over half of them had engine problems because they didn't pickle them right at New Jersey, and the engines were just, they were in sad shape. So they first had to, all they did was add places for the towing cables to go, but they had to do engine work on almost, I think, 25 of them. And they had issues, and they had some issues there getting parts and everything. But this is the Vultee Vengeance. And there's a picture of one, and you notice it's got the, doesn't have a U.S. Star on it there. It's got a different one. And, you know, I guess to say it nicely, that was an example of a, you could say, a dog of a plane in World War II. They couldn't find I don't think it was fast enough. Dive bombing, like I said, we had other planes that could do the same job better. Here's a picture of the probably a day shift. You know, they had 600 employees working around the clock when they did have a job there to do. But you can see all the personnel there out there. Based on that story about Tully, Florado, I think that's him there, but I'm probably guessing. You know, he's got the overcoat and he sort of looks a little shady. Okay, here's some more. There's Oscar Haas again, but with the P-51s. And then right here, that's him with, these aren't test pilots, but these are some of the key people that actually made the Mod Center work. These are your line mechanics and line chiefs, that they would be the key people for organizing and figuring out and supervising the employees actually doing the work, and then making sure things were done right. Now what's interesting is, you know, I'm sure none of you have seen some of these pictures, but the aviation archives over, you know, those 30, 40 years that he was collecting all this information, these were photos and different things from different people that he's talked to, that he mailed requests to and stuff like that. So once we get that collection digitized, it's definitely worth, you know, looking things up. A lot of interesting information. Okay, so what happened after the war? Well, the Mod Center was closed in late 44, and the 600 employees were absorbed into the Republic plant, okay? And then the Republic plant started slowing down in terms of how many shifts and everything. So there's Dilbert with a tear in his eye saying, exit Dilbert, bye-bye, with the Mod Center. Okay, so I think I'm accurate on this based on my research. The first place that took it over after the war was Sky Service. And so this is how they advertised. You had a big sign on the top of the hangar, so if you're flying by and you need gas, hey, I'm going to go down to Evansville Airport and fill up here. Okay? And that's what it looked like there. Whoops. Okay, then Lake Central Airlines maintenance, they leased it out. You had Air Reserve from May to October 57. They used to be in that. Airways Flight Service, another either private type airline. 95th 08 Air Force Reserve Recovery Unit, so it was used at its original role in, I guess, fixing planes, doing maintenance on planes. Then I think a lot of you people know Sunbeam Plastics had that for a long time. And then during early 70s, when they needed to, I think, change the location of a taxiway, I think that's when the main building was demolished. And then we all know all the work that was done when they upgraded the airport. And that's why the area doesn't look recognizable at all, because they did all that change for the new terminal, lengthened the runway and all that work. So just a short notice in a nutshell, that's the talking about the modification center. Do I have anybody have any questions that I could maybe answer?
If you've got a question, raise your hand and I'll come out and get your question. Brian?
Got a few. So we'll let John get over there so everybody can hear your question.
Do I remember right that Major Wright is the one that Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is named after?
To be honest, I'd have to look that up, but I'm not really sure. I mean, same name, but I'm not sure whether Wright-Patterson was named. Since it was named that, as these guys remember it, I doubt if a living Air Force officer, it would have been named after the same guy that was, you're saying, that I referenced here in that photo?
I know it was the Patterson Air Force Base for a long time.
Yeah, it might have been a different Wright. I'd have to look that up, but that's interesting. Oh, Wilbur and Orville Wright was what it was named after. Now, I don't know if this Bailey Wright, whether he was related to them or not, I don't know. Yeah, John.
Hi, I was just wondering in your research, have you discovered any information about spies?
Not necessarily spies. I didn't necessarily want to get into here because I needed to look some more, but part of these interviews they're talking about, have you seen any sabotage? Okay, and yes, there was instances both at the Republic plant and that they picked up a little bit at the modification center of actual sabotage. It could be nothing else but that. If I remember correctly, one of the things they talked about was that they kept getting planes that they would smell gas fumes in it. And since the tank was right behind the engine, between the tank and the cockpit, and what they discovered was that it appeared that somebody was taking a very thin ice pick, puncturing the tank, and putting a small tube up in there. And then what it would do was slowly drip out some gas. And I don't know if they were thinking in the future you'd have an explosive problem or something like that, but they did speculate that they had one crash of a Mod Center test pilot up in, I think, northern Gibson County, where people on the ground, they just came down in a shallow dive, didn't take any, and just crashed right into the ground, and they were thinking it was around the same time period. He might have been overcome by gasoline fumes or something like that. But there are instances there. I haven't gotten into, this is just the detail on the modification center and a few files. He's got all kinds of interviews and everything of the main Republic plant, and I'm sure there's some information there about spies or sabotage. But yeah, there was some of that going on that they were keeping track of. Any other questions? Norm?
Yeah, okay, the P-47, you know, you had the ratchet thing, and so they had to remodel and redo the plane from the cockpit to the tail to go to the bubble. Now, when did they do that? And did they do that at Republic, or where did they do that originally?
Well, I'm doing a little bit of speculation, but I know going to the bubble first, you had a lot of planes actually go out and go into theater without that ridge being there. And I do know that between fixing that in the actual factory, that those P-47s would come to different mod centers and they would either add it there or they would do some additions even. I'm not sure if they did any in theater, but that would have been an example where they actually did that change of the canopy. I think there was an actual question that all the major things to put the bubble on was done at the actual assembly line, not the mod centers.
Yeah,
But I think when they had the issue where they found out that I think you were up at a certain altitude at a certain speed, you had no aileron control in one direction. You had it in the other direction, but not in the other one. It was because of that airflow disruption past that bubble that the Razorback, you didn't have to worry about on that. And that's where they came up with that. There's actually a file up in those archives that explain how they found that out and had other interviews on exactly how they figured out how to fix that, you know. Any other questions? All right, if not, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mike. So, it was great that Mike and Kathy could fill in. at the last minute. And thanks to both of them. Our cleanup crew, the guys who take the tables and chairs down, I'd like to talk to you over where Pete is standing. So before you take tables and chairs down, please meet where Pete is standing. Thanks. See you October the 2nd, I think.